The truth about relationships with narcissistic people is that they tend to leave you with unanswered questions long after everything has actually ended. One question comes up over and over again. Does the narcissist ever feel any real shame about how they treated me? It's a completely understandable thing to wonder, because once you've poured your heart, your trust, and your emotional energy into someone who repeatedly brushed off your feelings, twisted your sense of reality, or made you doubt your own value, it's natural to hope that eventually they'll wake up and recognize the damage they caused. But making sense of narcissistic behavior means learning to separate hope from what's actually true. Shame, guilt, regret, and real accountability are not interchangeable. Mixing these emotions up in your mind can keep you tethered to someone who is never going to be able to give you the closure you're looking for. The point of everything we're about to walk through isn't to help you understand a narcissist well enough to fix them. It's to help you understand them well enough to finally set yourself free. Understanding what's actually happening is one of the most powerful forms of emotional protection there is. The clearer your picture of what's going on beneath the surface, the less likely you are to take their behavior personally or blame yourself for the pain it caused. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about narcissism is the idea that narcissists never feel any shame at all. The reality is far more complicated than that. Underneath a lot of narcissistic personalities sits an overwhelming fear of being exposed as inadequate, flawed, or fundamentally unworthy. Emotionally healthy people are generally able to acknowledge their own imperfections without feeling completely wrecked by them. They understand that making a mistake doesn't rewrite their entire identity. A narcissist tends to experience their own flaws very differently. To them, admitting they hurt someone can feel almost like admitting they're broken at their core. Because that feeling is so threatening, they build powerful psychological defenses to avoid ever having to sit with it directly. Rather than saying, "I made a mistake," they convince themselves someone else caused the problem. Instead of allowing themselves to feel vulnerable, they get defensive. Instead of taking responsibility, they quietly rewrite the whole story. This is exactly why people who've been in relationships with narcissists so often walk away confused. They expect the same emotional process they'd go through themselves if they'd hurt someone they loved. But narcissistic defenses interrupt that process long before any real accountability has a chance to develop. When shame does start bubbling up, it almost never shows up looking like sadness or genuine remorse. Instead, it tends to disguise itself as anger, criticism, blame, or a sudden need for control. This is one of the most important things to understand here, because so many survivors mistake these reactions for confidence, or worse, for indifference. In reality, these behaviors usually function as emotional armor. Picture standing in front of a mirror that reflects back every hurtful thing you've ever done. A healthy person might feel uncomfortable looking at that reflection, but eventually they can accept it and grow from what they see. A narcissist typically can't tolerate that reflection at all. Instead of changing themselves in response to it, they try to shatter the mirror. They criticize whoever challenges them, attack anyone who tries to hold them accountable, spread rumors, or recast themselves as the real victim of the situation. None of that is a sign of emotional strength. It's a sign of emotional avoidance. The louder they blame everyone else, the harder they're often working underneath it all to silence a shame they can't bring themselves to face directly. Understanding this doesn't excuse anything they've done, but it does explain why real, lasting change is so rare. So many people spend years hoping the narcissist will finally apologize, finally acknowledge the pain they caused. And while genuine apologies do happen in healthy relationships, they're far less common once narcissistic patterns are deeply entrenched. Feeling ashamed and taking responsibility are two completely different things. A person can privately feel discomfort, even something close to regret, while still refusing to ever admit out loud that they were wrong, because acknowledging the truth threatens the carefully built image they've spent years protecting. So instead of apologizing, they minimize what you went through, or insist you completely misunderstood the situation. In some cases, they'll even flip it and accuse you of being the one who was actually abusive, leaving survivors questioning their own memory. This is exactly why understanding these patterns matters so much. Once you can actually see them clearly, you stop expecting accountability from someone whose entire emotional survival depends on avoiding it. One of the more surprising truths in all of this is that your own healing can become one of the clearest signs of the shame they're hiding from. When you stop chasing them, stop defending yourself, and start rebuilding your own confidence instead, you quietly take away the role they were counting on you to keep playing. Narcissistic relationships tend to run on emotional dependence. They expect you to keep seeking their approval, keep hoping they'll eventually become the person you always believed they could be. But once you start living peacefully without them, your growth becomes living proof that their control over you doesn't work anymore. That doesn't mean they'll suddenly come clean about everything. In a lot of cases, they become more dismissive, more critical, or try to work their way back into your life. And none of that is proof of love or remorse. More often, it's a reaction to the discomfort of losing influence they once had. Maybe the biggest lesson in all of this is that your healing can never depend on someone else's self-awareness. Waiting for a narcissist to admit they hurt you puts your emotional future in the hands of someone who has already shown you they're not capable of offering emotional safety. Your worth was never tied to their apology. Real closure isn't finally hearing them say, "I was wrong." Real closure is reaching a place where you no longer need those words to feel at peace. That's emotional freedom, and it's a victory no narcissist can ever take from you. Have you ever lain awake wondering whether the person who hurt you ever thinks about what they did? Maybe you replay old conversations, hunting for the exact moment everything shifted, or ask yourself whether they've ever felt real guilt, regret, or shame for manipulating you and making you question your own grip on reality. These questions come up constantly for people recovering from narcissistic relationships because emotional abuse rarely wraps up with clean answers. It leaves behind confusion, self-doubt, and an overwhelming pull to understand what actually happened. But before we can answer whether a narcissist feels ashamed, we first need to get clear on what shame actually is and how it differs from guilt and from real accountability, because these words tend to get used interchangeably, even though psychologically they describe very different experiences. Healthy shame is an uncomfortable internal signal telling you that you've acted in a way that conflicts with your own values. It nudges you toward reflection, empathy, and growth. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Real accountability goes further and says, "I recognize the harm I caused, I take responsibility for it, and I actually want to make things right." These are the emotional processes that let people repair relationships and grow into better versions of themselves. They require humility, honesty, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of running from them. Most emotionally healthy people can do this, even though it's genuinely hard. Narcissistic personalities tend to struggle badly with this whole process because their emotional world is built entirely around protecting a fragile sense of self. They might come across as confident, superior, even untouchable on the outside, but a lot of psychologists point out that this outward image is really just a defense mechanism, shielding them from deep feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability underneath. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, admitting fault doesn't feel like acknowledging a simple mistake. It feels closer to admitting they're fundamentally worthless. That feeling becomes so unbearable that their mind automatically throws up defenses to push shame away before it can even be consciously processed. This is exactly why people are so often thrown off after confronting a narcissist about something hurtful they did. Instead of hearing, "You're right, I'm sorry," they hear excuses, blame, denial, or a sudden counterattack. The whole conversation somehow flips and becomes about your flaws instead of their actions. They might insist you misunderstood them, accuse you of being overly sensitive, or claim the entire thing was somehow your fault to begin with. None of that reflects emotional maturity. It's a protective strategy meant to keep any real self-reflection as far away as possible. Understanding this distinction matters enormously because so many survivors convince themselves that if they could just explain things a little better, provide a little more evidence, or stay patient a little longer, the narcissist would eventually get it, would eventually understand the pain they caused. Unfortunately, emotional insight can't be forced onto someone whose defenses exist specifically to avoid it. The more directly their behavior threatens the image they've built of themselves, the more likely they are to get defensive instead of reflective. That realization can feel disappointing at first, but it's also deeply freeing once it settles in. It means their refusal to acknowledge your pain isn't proof that what you experienced wasn't real. It isn't evidence that you deserve to be treated that way or that you somehow failed to explain yourself clearly enough. Most of the time, it simply reflects their own inability to tolerate the emotional discomfort that genuine accountability demands. Once you really understand that difference, you stop measuring your own worth by whether they're willing to admit the truth. Instead, You start trusting your own experience, honoring your own healing, and recognizing that real closure doesn't always come from someone else's apology. Sometimes it comes from understanding exactly why that apology might never show up and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. That shift in perspective is where genuine emotional freedom actually starts. One of the most disorienting things about recovering from narcissistic abuse is watching the dramatic reactions that follow even the smallest attempt at holding someone accountable. You might calmly bring up something hurtful they said, fully expecting a reasonable conversation, and instead they suddenly go cold, defensive, or even cruel. Sometimes they accuse you of attacking them out of nowhere, dredge up mistakes you made years earlier, or just change the subject entirely. To anyone who hasn't seen this pattern before, it can look completely irrational, but viewed through the lens of narcissistic defenses, it starts to make more sense. What looks like confidence or toughness is often a desperate attempt to escape feelings they simply can't sit with. One of those feelings is shame. Shame is one of the most painful emotions a person can experience because it doesn't just whisper, "I made a mistake." It whispers, "There is something fundamentally wrong with me." Emotionally healthy people are usually able to separate their actions from their identity, understanding that a bad decision doesn't permanently make them a bad person. That allows them to apologize and grow without feeling emotionally obliterated. Someone with strong narcissistic traits often can't make that same separation because their whole self-image is built around appearing successful, superior, or morally right. And anything that threatens that image feels unbearable. Rather than sitting with that discomfort, most narcissists instinctively go on the defensive, and that defense rarely looks like vulnerability. It usually looks like anger, criticism, blame, control, or withdrawal. Say you confront them about a lie, and suddenly you're the paranoid one. Say you express sadness over how they treated you, and now you're overly dramatic. Say you set a reasonable boundary, and out of nowhere, you're the selfish one. These reactions shift the attention away from what they did and dump the emotional burden back onto you. Psychologists call this projection. Instead of recognizing something they can't accept about themselves, they unconsciously assign that exact quality to you. They call you manipulative while manipulating you, or accuse you of being controlling while trying to dictate every decision you make. For anyone on the receiving end, this creates real confusion because you start questioning your own read on reality. And over time, that self-doubt becomes one of the most damaging effects of emotional abuse. Another common defense is a heightened need for control. If acknowledging your pain would mean admitting they behaved unfairly, they might instead ramp up controlling behavior, giving you the silent treatment, criticizing your accomplishments, or suddenly trying to pull you back in after a stretch of distance. None of that is evidence of developing empathy. More often, it's an attempt to restore the emotional balance that protects them from uncomfortable truths. Understanding all of this is genuinely empowering because it changes the question you're asking yourself. Instead of wondering, why are they acting this way? You start asking, what are they actually avoiding right now? That shift lets you stop taking every insult, every accusation so personally. Their reactions become information about them, not a verdict on your worth. Someone else's inability to face their own shame was never supposed to become your job to fix. Real healing starts the moment you stop chasing understanding from the person who created the confusion and start trusting the clarity you build by educating yourself instead. One of the hardest things to accept after leaving a narcissistic relationship is that someone can genuinely experience private moments of shame without that shame ever turning into actual accountability for the harm they caused. So many survivors hold on to hope because they believe that if the narcissist feels bad enough, eventually an apology will come. They picture the day the narcissist finally calls, admits everything, acknowledges the pain they caused, and finally gives them the validation they've been craving. That hope makes total sense because healthy relationships teach us that remorse usually leads to repair. When emotionally healthy people realize they've hurt someone they care about, they typically feel real empathy, accept responsibility for it, and put in a sincere effort to actually change. They understand that love comes with accountability built in. Unfortunately, narcissistic behavior tends to follow a different track. A narcissist might feel genuine discomfort when they lose a relationship or realize they no longer hold influence over someone they used to control. But that discomfort doesn't automatically turn into real responsibility. Instead of asking, how did my behavior hurt this person? They're more likely to ask, how has this affected me? That difference shows exactly where their emotional focus sits. on the consequences they're personally facing rather than the pain someone else went through. They might genuinely miss the admiration or control the relationship gave them without having developed any real empathy for the person they mistreated. This is why survivors often end up confused when a narcissist suddenly reappears after months or years of silence. The message might sound warm or apologetic at first, saying they've been thinking about you or wish things had gone differently. It's important to look past the language and pay attention to the pattern underneath. Does the message contain specific accountability or vague statements? Does the focus shift right back to them within a sentence or two? Genuine accountability is specific, consistent, and backed by changed behavior over time. Empty remorse feels emotional in the moment and disappears the second they've regained a sense of control. Another reason accountability is so difficult for narcissistic personalities is that admitting wrongdoing threatens the entire identity they've spent years constructing. They often genuinely see themselves as the victim, the hero, or the misunderstood one. Accepting real responsibility would mean dismantling that whole story. So instead, they rewrite history, claiming you exaggerated everything or that you forced them to act that way. These strategies protect their self-image but block any real chance of growth. This can be genuinely heartbreaking for survivors, but there's also real freedom in understanding it. The absence of accountability doesn't mean your pain didn't matter or that your memories are wrong. It simply reflects the other person's emotional limitations. Your healing stops depending on hearing the words "I was wrong" and starts depending on believing yourself. One of the most powerful moments in your entire healing journey happens the day you start changing. Not for the narcissist, not to prove a point, but purely for yourself. At first, this shift is usually quiet. You stop replying to every message. Stop defending yourself against unfair accusations. Stop explaining the same boundary over and over. You start putting your energy into your own well-being instead of managing someone else's emotions around the clock. The person who used to depend on your reactions and attention suddenly discovers their old strategies just don't work on you anymore. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, that's deeply unsettling because your healing becomes a mirror reflecting something they've spent years avoiding. Narcissistic relationships tend to run on a serious imbalance of power. The narcissist expects to hold the position of authority while the other person stays focused on earning approval and keeping the peace. When your healing begins, that cycle starts to break down. You stop chasing constant reassurance and start seeing that your peace matters more than winning another argument. Your growth can genuinely trigger discomfort in them because it challenges whatever story they'd been telling themselves. Every healthy boundary you hold, every moment of happiness you experience without them becomes quiet proof that you were never as powerless as they wanted you to believe. Rather than facing that discomfort head-on, they might instead respond with behaviors designed to grab back a sense of control. A casual message out of nowhere, unusual criticism, spreading rumors, or oddly enough, sudden kindness and nostalgia, meant to rebuild the connection that once gave them influence. These behaviors can easily get mistaken for love or real change, so it's worth evaluating them carefully. Genuine change shows up through consistent accountability and long-term transformation, not temporary gestures that vanish the moment they've regained your attention. It's also worth remembering that your healing was never meant to be an act of revenge. The goal was never to make the narcissist jealous, guilty, or ashamed of themselves. If your recovery becomes centered around proving something to them, they're still sitting at the center of your emotional world, even if it doesn't feel that way. Real healing happens once your attention shifts completely away from their reactions and lands fully on your own growth instead. There's something genuinely empowering about reaching the point where someone else's inability to value you no longer shapes how you see yourself. You gain clarity where there used to be confusion, self-respect where there used to be self-doubt, and relationships built on mutual respect instead of emotional control. Whether the narcissist ever confronts their own hidden shame is ultimately their responsibility, not yours. The real victory was never watching them regret losing you. It's reaching a place where your happiness no longer depends on whether that regret ever shows up at all. As long as you're waiting for the narcissist to apologize or finally acknowledge the pain they caused, your emotional well-being stays tied to someone who has shown you repeatedly that they're unwilling to provide the understanding you deserve. That doesn't mean wanting closure is wrong. It's completely human to want real answers after being manipulated or emotionally neglected. But true healing begins the moment you realize the validation you're searching for is far more reliable when it comes from your own clarity than from someone else's approval. So many survivors spend years imagining a conversation that may never happen, picturing the narcissist finally saying, "I was wrong, you deserved better." Those words would feel meaningful if they ever came, but depending entirely on them can turn into its own kind of emotional captivity. Emotional freedom starts the moment you stop waiting for someone else to unlock the door and realize you've been holding the key the entire time. One of the biggest lasting effects of narcissistic abuse is that it teaches people to distrust themselves. After being told again and again that you're too sensitive or impossible to please, a lot of survivors start second-guessing their own judgment, replaying conversations endlessly, searching for the explanation that will finally make everything click into place. That kind of self-doubt is exhausting because it keeps the mind stuck in the past instead of letting it move forward. Understanding these patterns changes that. The more you learn about narcissistic dynamics, gaslighting, projection, and blame shifting, the less likely you are to keep internalizing the distorted messages you once believed about yourself. Knowledge becomes the ground you rebuild your self-trust on. Healing also means accepting a difficult truth. Not everyone is capable of giving you what you deserve. Some people lack the emotional maturity to apologize sincerely, and recognizing that isn't about becoming cynical, it's about becoming realistic. Once you stop expecting emotional safety from someone who consistently causes harm, you start making healthier choices about where you invest your time and heart. As your healing deepens, the questions that used to consume your every thought slowly lose their grip. Instead of wondering if they miss you, you focus on building a life you actually enjoy. Instead of asking whether they feel ashamed, you celebrate who you're becoming. This doesn't mean the past disappears or that what happened was insignificant. It means the pain stops steering the direction of your life. The strongest form of closure was never going to be hearing the perfect apology. It's waking up one day and realizing you don't need it anymore, and understanding that another person's inability to love you in a healthy way says everything about their limitations and nothing about your worth. Once you reach that place, the narcissist becomes one chapter, not the entire book, and that's a victory nobody can ever take away from you. The greatest transformation that can come out of surviving a narcissistic relationship isn't watching the narcissist finally admit they were wrong. It's discovering that your life becomes fuller, stronger, and genuinely more peaceful once you stop making their thoughts and reactions the center of your world. For so long, your emotional energy was probably consumed by trying to understand them, picking apart every conversation, wondering if they ever really loved you or secretly regretted what they did. Those questions make sense, but they also keep you tethered to the exact person you're trying to heal from. Real freedom starts the moment you take that energy back and redirect it toward yourself. Someone else's hidden shame was never yours to uncover, and you can't heal another person by sacrificing your own well-being. Real change is an internal decision, and accepting that it can't be negotiated or earned through self-sacrifice marks the real beginning of emotional independence. Try asking yourself different questions from here on out. Instead of asking, "Do they finally miss me?" ask, "Am I building a life that actually brings me peace?" Instead of wondering, "Are they ashamed of how they treated me?" ask, "Am I treating myself with the kindness and respect I deserve?" Instead of hoping they'll finally recognize your value, recognize it yourself. These shifts might sound small, but they completely change the direction your emotional journey takes. Your focus moves away from chasing someone else's validation and toward building real, lasting self-worth instead. One of the more beautiful things about healing is that it usually happens quietly. There's rarely a dramatic announcement, no single moment where everything suddenly feels perfect. Instead, you start noticing small shifts. You laugh a little more easily. You sleep a little more peacefully. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop feeling the need to defend your choices to people who already decided not to understand you. The memories that once triggered overwhelming pain start losing their sting. That doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means those experiences stop controlling your present. As your confidence grows, you also start setting healthier standards for what kind of relationships you let into your life going forward. You get better at spotting red flags, more comfortable setting boundaries, less willing to accept disrespect dressed up as love. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, empathy, and real accountability. They don't require constant anxiety, emotional confusion, or endless attempts to prove your own worth. Every boundary you hold becomes an act of self-respect, and every healthy choice you make strengthens the foundation you're building your future on. Maybe the most meaningful victory of all is reaching the point where the narcissist no longer holds the most important place in your story. They become part of your past, not the author writing your future. Their inability to face their own shame no longer determines your happiness. Their refusal to apologize no longer stands in your way. Instead, your life becomes centered around your own growth, your own values, and your own peace. You discover that your strength was never about changing another person. It was always about changing the relationship you have with yourself. And once that shift really settles in, something extraordinary happens. You stop surviving and start actually living. You stop waiting and start creating. You stop carrying the weight of someone else's emotional limitations and start stepping into the limitless possibilities that come with finally knowing your own worth. That's true freedom, and it's the greatest gift you could ever give yourself after everything you've been through.